He had been running for years, but never forward. Every morning felt the same. Alarm. Silence. The hollow ache in his chest that came from doing everything right and still feeling wrong inside. His name was Ethan Cole, though he hardly remembered what that meant anymore. Labels like employee, friend, son, they blurred together until none of them felt real. What he did know was that somewhere between ambition and exhaustion, he had lost himself. He used to dream of greatness, not fame, not money, just mastery. He wanted to look in the mirror one day and know he'd reached the edge of what he was capable of. But somewhere along the line, life buried that fire under bills, noise, and the quiet disappointment of ordinary days. He still showed up at work, nodded at people, and smiled on command. He laughed when others laughed, even when he didn't get the joke. But at night, when the city's hum finally died, he'd sit at the window with his coffee gone cold and whisper to no one, "There has to be more than this." One night, he searched for something, anything, that might make him feel alive again. He found an old video online. The speaker said, "No one is coming to save you." That line hit like a brick. He paused the video and stared at his reflection on the dark screen. The truth landed heavy. Nobody was coming. Not his friends, not his boss, not fate. He realized that all the times he'd waited for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right inspiration, he'd been waiting for someone who didn't exist. That night, he decided to do something irrational. He wrote a letter to himself. It said, "Tomorrow you start training your mind like your life depends on it, because it does." He didn't even know what that meant yet, but he felt a strange pulse in his chest, like a spark had survived the ashes. The next morning he woke up before sunrise for the first time in years. His room was dim, the air sharp and cold. He didn't have a plan, just a need. He jogged down the empty streets, lungs burning, feet heavy. The city still slept, and the only sound was his breathing. It felt terrible. It felt alive. He didn't stop, even when every part of him screamed. When he finally collapsed on the pavement, gasping, he realized something. Pain was honest. It didn't lie or flatter. It told him exactly where he was. And for the first time, he wanted to face it. That became his ritual. Every morning, before the noise, before the doubts, he ran. Some days he ran 2 miles, some days 5. The distance didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd stopped waiting to be ready. At first, no one noticed. That was the hardest part. You expect the world to reward your effort, to clap when you change. But silence is the first test of growth. No one congratulated him. His coworkers still complained about Mondays. His friends still scrolled through their phones. And he learned that the path to peak, performance isn't lined with applause. It's lined with solitude. He began keeping a notebook, jotting down what he learned from each day's run. Small notes became principles. Discipline isn't punishment, it's self-respect. Motivation dies. Systems live. If it's easy, it's lying to you. Over time, these notes grew into his new language. He stopped chasing comfort and started chasing clarity. He studied himself like a scientist studies a storm. Why did he quit when things got hard? Why did he avoid the things that mattered most? He realized he'd been mistaking feeling good for being good. Months passed. His body hardened, but his mind sharpened faster. He noticed patterns in people around him. Most weren't lazy, they were distracted. They'd trade hours of purpose for seconds of pleasure. He saw himself in them, and it terrified him. So he trained harder, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Fear of falling back asleep inside his own life. He started reading psychology, flow states, neuroplasticity, the science of performance. He realized that greatness wasn't a mystery, it was math. Repetition plus feedback plus focus, growth. He understood something crucial. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So he built systems. He scheduled his mornings like a soldier. He limited distractions, deleted apps, cut toxic habits. Every hour had a purpose, even rest. And slowly, the noise in his mind began to fade. What replaced it was something quieter, but stronger. Discipline. Sometimes he'd run until his vision blurred. Sometimes he'd stare at the sunrise and feel tears sting his eyes for no reason other than gratitude. Not for success, but for the war itself. Because that's what no one tells you. Chasing peak performance feels like war. A war against comfort. A war against who you were yesterday. And every small victory feels like bleeding in the right direction. There were days he wanted to quit. Days when the old voice returned, whispering, "It doesn't matter. You'll never be enough." But then he'd open his notebook, read his own handwriting, and remember, no one is coming. Keep going anyway. He started to notice subtle changes. The way people spoke to him, different. The way he carried himself, steadier. Even failure started to feel different. It wasn't a verdict anymore. It was data, feedback, information. When people asked what he was training for, he'd just smile. He wasn't training for a race. He was training for life. One cold evening, he sat by the river watching the city lights flicker on the water. His reflection looked stronger now, same scars, but fewer excuses. He thought about the people who quit, the ones who said, maybe next year. And he realized how small the gap really was between failure and greatness. It's not talent, it's not luck, it's the decision to keep showing up after the feeling fades. That night, he wrote one final note in his book. Peak performance isn't about doing your best when you feel inspired. It's about doing what's required when you don't. He closed the notebook, exhaled, and smiled. A quiet, private smile that no one saw. He knew tomorrow would hurt. He also knew he'd be there anyway. And here's the truth most people never understand until it's too late. The psychology of peak performance isn't about chasing perfection. It's about building tolerance for imperfection. It's about turning pain into pattern. It's learning to stay when every part of you wants to run. Peak performers aren't born extraordinary. They're ordinary people who refuse to stop. They fail more than others, but they interpret failure differently. Where most see endings, they see evidence. Where most feel doubt, they feel direction. Because every breakdown, every dark night, every silent battle becomes proof. You are capable of more than your mind believes, and that's the secret. The body follows where belief leads. Years later, Ethan wasn't famous. He didn't become a billionaire or a best-selling author. But he had peace. And that was rarer. He'd built a life that made sense from the inside. His habits were his armor, his discipline his compass. He still failed. He still felt pain. But it no longer owned him. He had learned to dance with it. Because the goal of peak performance isn't to avoid suffering, it's to use it, to burn the weakness, refine the strength, and emerge not flawless but forged. That's what mastery really means. The storm never stops. You just learn how to stand in it. The city was silent again. Another morning. Ethan laced his shoes, stepped outside, and felt the chill bite his skin. He looked up at the fading stars and whispered the same 3 words that had started it all. No one's coming. Then he smiled because now he didn't need anyone to. The rain had a rhythm that night, steady, relentless, like a heartbeat that refused to die. Ethan stood beneath the flickering streetlight, drenched to the bone, watching the city blur through streaks of water. Every droplet hit the pavement like a reminder. Perfection never comes. Only persistence does. He'd been training for almost a year now. The body stronger, the mind sharper, the soul quieter. But something had shifted lately. The fire that once kept him alive had started to burn too hot. He wasn't chasing growth anymore. He was chasing control. And control is a drug that never satisfies. He'd started timing everything: meals, workouts, sleep, even conversations. He'd cut off friends who didn't add value. He spoke less, smiled less, and treated rest like weakness. From the outside, he looked unstoppable. Inside, he was tightening a noose of his own making. One evening, he was at the bay, gym alone. The mirrors glowed with artificial light, and the sound of clanging metal echoed like thunder. He loaded the bar until it bent slightly, as I'm too heavy for him, but he didn't care. He lifted once, twice, then again. His vision pulsed at the edges. His arms shook. He screamed through his teeth, "One more!" And then nothing. The bar pinned him. The weight didn't just crush his chest, it crushed the illusion that he was invincible. For the first time in months, he felt small again, human again. A stranger rushed over and helped lift the bar. Ethan sat up, coughing, staring at the floor. His hands trembled. The man asked if he was okay. Ethan nodded but didn't speak. He just watched the sweat drip from his face onto the concrete, each drop a piece of the armor he'd been hiding behind. That night, walking home with his hoodie soaked through, he realized something painful. He'd turned discipline into obsession. And obsession disguised as purpose is how people destroy themselves. He took a few days off training. It felt wrong, like betrayal. His body rested, but his mind didn't. He started hearing whispers of guilt in the quiet. You're falling behind. You're getting weak. You're losing your edge. But then a different voice emerged, softer, one he hadn't heard in a long time. It said, maybe winning isn't about never stopping. Maybe it's about knowing when to breathe. He didn't want to believe it. Rest felt like surrender. But he remembered something his father used to say, you can't sharpen a blade by grinding it to dust. So he sat still for once. He took long walks without music, watched sunsets instead of timers, listened to his breath like it was an old friend returning home. At first it was uncomfortable and almost painful to be present. But then slowly it became powerful. He began to understand the second half of peak performance, the part nobody talks about, the silence. Most people think success is loud, all fire and motion. But mastery, real mastery, hides in stillness. It's the pause between heartbeats, the calm between storms. He realized that his earlier transformation had been about becoming strong, but this part was about staying sane. And that balance, that's where few ever reach. He wrote in his notebook again. Too much discipline without peace turns victory into punishment. Rest is not the enemy of performance, it's the oxygen of it. Weeks passed. His workouts changed. He trained smarter now, slower, deeper, more aware. He stopped chasing numbers. He started chasing presence. One morning as he ran through the park, he noticed how the light cut through the fog like golden threads. Each breath looked visible, suspended in air. For once, he wasn't counting miles. He was just moving, alive, not mechanical. That's when a memory hit him. Years ago, he'd run this same path. Furious at himself, punishing every step. Back then, he thought pain was proof of progress. Now he understood pain isn't the proof. It's the portal. The point isn't to suffer endlessly. It's to learn what the suffering is teaching you. And what it had taught him was this: you don't rise by fighting yourself. You rise by mastering the dialogue within you. At work, people began to notice a different kind of energy in him. He wasn't louder. He wasn't showing off. He just radiated a still power, the kind that doesn't need validation. When his boss asked him to lead a project that everyone else avoided, he didn't hesitate. Not because he was confident of success, but because he was no longer afraid of failure. He'd finally understood the psychology behind peak performance. It's not the absence of fear. It's the relationship you build with it. You can't silence fear, but you can make it walk beside you. Late one night, Ethan met his old friend Marcus, a man he hadn't seen since his chaotic years. Marcus looked the same, charming smile, restless eyes, too many plans and no execution. They sat in a diner booth, the neon light painting their faces blue and red. Marcus said, "Man, you've changed. You used to talk about becoming something big. Now you sound like a monk." Ethan smiled. "Maybe I was chasing the wrong kind of big." Marcus laughed. "So what, you're just content now? You don't want more?" Ethan took a sip of his coffee. "I still want more, but I want better more. Not louder, not faster, deeper." Marcus rolled his eyes. "You sound like a self-help book." Ethan looked out the window, watching cars pass through the rain. He thought about answering but didn't. Some people don't hear you until they've fallen silent themselves. That night, he realized something else. You can't drag people up the mountain who still love the valley. His journey had started with pain, then turned into discipline, then flirted with obsession, and now it was becoming peace. He understood the full cycle of performance and how each stage could either build you or break you. Because growth has a dark side. You start to believe that your worth equals your output, that you must always do more, be more, prove more. But the truth is, the most powerful performers aren't addicted to doing. They're devoted to becoming. One morning he sat in meditation, eyes closed, breathing slow. His heartbeat sounded like distant thunder. And a thought surfaced, not from ego but from awareness. Peak performance isn't about speed, it's about presence under pressure. He realized all those years he'd been chasing intensity because it felt like progress, but intensity without intention is just chaos in disguise. The new challenge was harder than any weight, any run, any grind, to be fully there, moment to moment. That's when he smiled, because that's the final test every high performer faces. Not conquering the world, but controlling the mind that perceives it. Later that week, Ethan volunteered at a local youth center. He didn't post about it, didn't film it. He just showed up. A boy named Jamie asked, "Why do you do all this hard stuff? Doesn't it get exhausting?" Ethan laughed softly. "Of course it does, but you know what's worse?" The boy shook his head. "Feeling nothing. That's worse. The grind reminds you you're still alive." Jamie frowned. "So pain is good?" Ethan leaned closer. "Pain is a signal. It means there's something worth changing." That night, as he walked home, he realized how far he'd come. The boy's question lingered in his mind. Why do we chase hard things? Why do we run toward the edge when the world says to stay comfortable? Because deep down, we know that comfort kills potential, and discomfort, chosen, deliberate, purposeful, builds a kind of freedom no shortcut ever could. By the end of that year, Ethan's life looked completely different. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he was awake. He'd learned that the psychology of peak performance isn't a formula, it's a philosophy. It's waking up each morning and choosing the harder path, not because it guarantees success, but because it guarantees growth. It's falling 7 times and getting up 8, not out of pride, but out of principle. It's knowing that perfection isn't the goal. Progress is. He finally wrote the last page in his notebook. At the summit, you realized the mountain was never outside. It was you. He closed it, placed it on his shelf, and exhaled deeply. There would be more battles, more seasons of doubt, but he was no longer afraid of the cycle because he understood that the climb never ends, it just changes altitude. And in that endless climb, he'd found what every high performer is really chasing. Not the trophy, not the applause, but peace in motion. The rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets. Ethan stepped outside, the air fresh and cold against his skin. He looked up at the night sky, a faint grin spreading across his face. For once, there was no voice arguing inside him, no noise, just presence. He whispered to himself, "We made it this far." Then, like he always did, he ran, not to escape, not to prove, but to feel the rhythm of being alive, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the quiet city, steady, measured, infinite. Success has a sound. It isn't applause. It's the quiet hum of a man working long after everyone's gone home. For Ethan, that hum had become his heartbeat. The rhythm of screens flickering at 2 a.m., the whisper of notebooks filled with ideas that no one else would ever read. He'd crossed the threshold between ambition and obsession, and though the world called it success, inside it felt more like exile. He had achieved what he once dreamed of. The company he built was now a living, breathing force. People quoted his words, praised his discipline, envied his drive, but behind the image was a man running from silence, afraid of the day when there would be nothing left to prove. Because Ethan's success wasn't born from peace, it was born from pain, and pain doesn't disappear when you win. It only gets quieter, smarter, and more patient. He woke up every morning before dawn chasing the same ghost he once called purpose. Yet lately he couldn't tell if he was chasing greatness or escaping emptiness. Every victory felt thinner than the last, like drinking salt water when you're dying of thirst. In public he was unstoppable, polished, calm, magnetic. But when he looked in the mirror, his reflection had questions his success couldn't answer. Why are you still not satisfied? Why does peace feel like failure? It was a strange paradox. The more he achieved, the more fragile his confidence became. He'd learned to master the art of performance, not just in his work, but in his own identity. He played the role of the driven one, the visionary, the unstoppable, and people believed it. But deep down, Ethan knew he wasn't performing for the world. He was performing for himself, to silence the voice that whispered, "You're still not enough." The human mind is a battlefield where comfort and growth wage a silent war. And Ethan was losing because he'd mistaken exhaustion for excellence. He wasn't building anymore. He was clinging to his reputation, to his image, to the illusion that being busy meant being alive. Every day he told himself, just one more project, one more milestone, then I'll rest. But he never did, because rest felt like weakness, and weakness was the enemy he could never forgive. Late one night, Ethan stood in his office, city lights burning below him like stars trapped in glass. He'd just finished a meeting that should have felt victorious, a deal that cemented his legacy. But the room felt heavy. The silence screamed louder than the applause ever had. He looked out the window and realized something chilling. He had become the very thing he once feared, a machine that runs perfectly but feels nothing. The climb had given him power, yes, but it had also taken something he didn't notice disappearing: wonder. The curiosity that once drove him had turned into calculation. The passion that once burned had turned into pressure. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt lost, not because he didn't know where he was going, but because he no longer knew why. He closed his laptop and walked to the elevator, leaving the building without telling anyone. The night air hit him like cold water. He walked aimlessly through the city, past neon lights, and strangers who didn't know his name. For the first time in forever, he wasn't Ethan the achiever. He was just another soul trying to breathe. He found himself near an old park, one he hadn't been to in years. He sat on a bench and stared at the dark horizon. It was quiet there, too quiet. And in that silence, the truth surfaced like a ghost. He had been so focused on becoming someone extraordinary that he forgot how to simply be someone. Success had given him everything except the ability to rest inside his own skin. And that realization hit harder than any failure ever could. He thought about his early days, just when the fire wasn't about recognition, but about the joy of creation. Back when he worked not to win, but to learn. Back when mistakes didn't feel fatal and passion felt pure. Somewhere along the way, the world taught him that enough is never enough, that you measure your worth by output, not fulfillment. That rest is for the weak, and the strong never stop. He'd believed it, and it broke him in ways success could never fix. As the night deepened, Ethan whispered to himself, maybe the real peak isn't at the top. Maybe it's when you stop needing to climb. He knew then. The psychology of peak performance isn't about perfection. It's about control, the ability to choose your battles instead of letting them choose you. And right now, Ethan's battle wasn't with failure. It was with himself. Could he learn to find worth beyond the work? Could he silence the inner critic without silencing his drive? Could he rediscover joy without killing the hunger that made him who he was? He didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time, he wasn't running from the questions. He sat there until dawn, watching the light return to the city. A slow, quiet reminder that even the darkest nights don't last forever. When the first ray of sun touched the skyline, Ethan smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because he finally understood something vital. The mind that conquers the world must first learn to make peace with itself. The journey to mastery isn't about speed, it's about awareness, because real performance isn't born from fear, it's born from balance, and balance isn't found, it's earned. Ethan stood, breathed deeply, and whispered into the morning, I'm not done, I'm just beginning again. And with that, he walked toward the sunrise, slower, lighter, but more powerful than ever. Dawn came softly that morning, not as a victory, but as a whisper. Ethan stood on the rooftop of his apartment building, coffee in hand, the city stretching beneath him like a living heartbeat. For years that view had meant conquest, the empire he'd built, the dominance he'd earned. But now, it looked different. The skyline wasn't a scoreboard anymore. It was a horizon, endless, indifferent, and strangely beautiful. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan wasn't rushing anywhere. No schedule, no inbox, no list screaming for his attention, just silence. And the uncomfortable truth that he didn't know who he was without the noise. At first, the quiet scared him. When he sat still, his mind clawed at him. You're falling behind. You're losing your edge. You're nothing without the grind. But beneath that chaos was something else. A faint pulse he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. Not the kind that chases results and the kind that asks questions. He started small. He read books that had nothing to do with success. He cooked his own breakfast instead of eating on the go. He took walks with no destination, watched strangers, studied the rhythm of life as if he were learning how to breathe again. It felt strange at first, like detoxing from an addiction he didn't know he had. Because in truth, Ethan had been addicted, not to success itself, but to the feeling of being in control, to the illusion that discipline meant dominance over emotion, to the rush of chasing more without ever asking more of what. One morning he found himself standing in front of a mirror again. The same man looked back, same eyes, same scars, but something subtle had shifted. He looked softer, not weaker, but quieter inside. That's when he realized peak performance isn't about how high you climb. It's about how still you can stand when the world tries to pull you in every direction. He began journaling again, not to track progress, but to listen. He wrote about fear, about guilt, about the quiet loneliness of being someone people admire but never truly know. And through those words, Ethan began to meet himself. Not the achiever, not the leader, but the human beneath the armor. Days turned into weeks. The urge to grind still whispered, but he didn't obey it blindly anymore. He learned to sit with discomfort instead of numbing it with work. He learned that rest wasn't laziness. It was maintenance for the soul. One afternoon, he visited an old gym he used to train at. It smelled the same, sweat, metal, grit. But now he wasn't there to compete. He was there to feel alive. Every rep, every breath, every heartbeat reminded him that growth isn't measured in trophies, but in presence. He remembered something his first mentor once said, a lesson he'd ignored for years. The goal isn't to beat others, it's to stop letting fear beat you. Those words echoed as he lifted. With each set, he wasn't fighting gravity. He was fighting the weight of his own expectations, and for the first time, he felt free. But peace isn't a switch. It's a practice. And rebuilding isn't about erasing your old self. It's about integrating it. There were nights when the old Ethan still showed up. Restless, hungry, critical. The voice would whisper, "You're wasting time." And Ethan would answer, "I'm learning how to live." He started teaching others what he'd learned, not through speeches, but through conversations. Young entrepreneurs, burnt-out executives, dreamers drowning in their own ambition, they all came to him expecting formulas. Instead, he gave them questions. What are you chasing? Would you still want it if no one saw it? Who are you without your goals? Some walked away confused. Others walked away lighter. The truth is, most people don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they never stop long enough to ask if they're running in the right direction. Ethan became obsessed again, but this time with awareness. He studied mindfulness, neuropsychology, the biology of stress. He learned how the brain confuses urgency with importance, how dopamine rewards the chase, not the catch, how silence, though uncomfortable, rewires focus and restores creativity. He began designing his days around energy, not hours. He'd work intensely, then disconnect completely, walk, breathe, reflect. He stopped chasing balance like a prize and started building it like a skill. That's when the irony hit him. The more he let go of control, the more powerful he became. Clients noticed, his team noticed, even his friends said he seemed different, calmer, but somehow sharper, like someone who could see the world in slow motion, because when the mind is quiet, clarity becomes a weapon. One evening, Ethan was invited to speak at a leadership summit. The organizers expected him to deliver another blueprint for success, metrics, habits, routines, but when he stepped on stage, he paused. The audience of hundreds stared back, waiting for brilliance. He simply said, "Success isn't about doing more. It's about doing what matters, with peace." The room went silent. Not the silence of boredom, the silence of realization. He continued, "We've been taught that high performance means sacrifice, but the highest performers aren't the ones who burn out fastest. They're the ones who can stay calm in chaos, who can act without fear, who can stop without guilt." For the first time, Ethan spoke not from strategy, but from experience. He told them about the nights he couldn't sleep, the deals that meant nothing after he won them, the mirror that reflected success but not peace. He said, "If your ambition costs you your presence, you've already paid too much." When he finished, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was soft, respectful, human. And that softness meant more than any standing ovation ever had. Weeks later, back at the park where his turning point began, Ethan sat on that same bench. But this time, the silence wasn't empty, it was alive, filled with awareness, gratitude, and possibility. He understood now. Peak performance is not the mountain summit. It's the steady breath that keeps you climbing. It's the peace you carry when the world demands chaos. It's knowing when to push and when to pause. He whispered to himself, "The mind performs best when the heart is at peace." And for the first time, he truly believed it, because he wasn't chasing greatness anymore. He was living it, quietly, consistently, freely. In the days that followed, Ethan began crafting something new. Not a business, not a brand, a philosophy, a way of life built on harmony between discipline and compassion. He called it still drive, the idea that motion without mindfulness is wasted energy, that true drive is steady, patient, and unshakable. He began writing a book about it, moi, not for fame, but for the version of himself who once thought pain was the only path. He wrote to remind others, You don't need to destroy yourself to become great. You just need to align yourself, mind, body, purpose. And in that process, Ethan discovered the final paradox of performance. The mind that once chased control found freedom in surrender. The man who once feared stillness found power in it. And the dream that once felt like a burden became a gift again. As he finished the last chapter, he looked out the window and noticed the same city skyline he'd once worshipped. It hadn't changed, but he had. He smiled softly and whispered, "The climb was never about reaching the top. It was about learning how to breathe on the way up." And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like he was chasing the sunrise. He felt like he was standing inside it. The morning began like any other, still, measured, deliberate. Ethan's world had finally found its rhythm. Work with awareness, rest without guilt, create without fear. For months, everything had felt balanced. He'd learned how to lead without losing himself, how to build without burning. But peace, he would soon learn, is never permanent. It must be tested to be real. He was in the middle of a meeting when the first crack appeared. A message slid across his phone screen, one sentence that froze the air around him. The board is voting tonight. They want a new direction. At first, he didn't react. He'd seen power games before, but this one felt different because the plan, the so-called new direction, was built on shortcuts, ethical corners cut for profit. And the man pushing it was someone Ethan had once mentored. For years, he had preached integrity as the foundation of performance. Now that belief was being turned against him. He sat still in the conference room, watching as his former protege, Lucas, presented glossy numbers promising rapid expansion, sky-high returns, dominance in markets Ethan had deliberately avoided. The board listened, captivated. Ethan could feel the shift, the seduction of success, the kind that sparkles before it burns. He spoke when Lucas finished, calmly, measured. "If we follow that path," he said, "we may gain speed, but we'll lose direction. We'll trade excellence for efficiency, purpose for profit." But he could see it, the hunger in their eyes. They wanted the rush again. They missed the chaos. When the vote ended, Ethan lost. By one. Just one. The company he built, the vision he protected, it was slipping into hands that didn't understand what it had cost him to create. He drove home in silence that night. City lights flickering like memories he couldn't stop replaying. He felt anger trying to rise, the old fire that once fueled his ambition. It whispered, "Fight back, prove them wrong, destroy them if you have to." But another voice, quieter, stronger, answered, "Don't let them decide who you become." Days passed, headlines bloomed. Ethan Ward steps down as CEO. Analysts debated his decision. Some called it wise, others called it weakness. He didn't correct any of them. Instead, he spent his mornings walking by the water, notebook in hand, retracing the line between pride and purpose. At night, he'd sit in his study, lights low, writing truths he wished someone had told him years ago. Greatness without grace is just noise. Peace that depends on control isn't peace at all. Sometimes walking away is the highest form of strength. But detachment is never easy. Every day he fought the temptation to step back into the arena, to prove one last time that he was right, that his way still worked, that the calm mind could still conquer the chaotic world. Until one morning a knock on his door changed everything. It was Ava, his operations director, one of the few who stayed loyal. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Ethan, you need to see this." She handed him a report. Numbers, transactions, buried documents. Lucas's expansion plan wasn't just reckless, it was corrupt. False deals, inflated valuations, investors being misled. Ethan's hands tightened around the pages. For a moment, the old instinct surged back. He could expose it, crush it, reclaim everything. But another thought followed. What's the cost? Because revenge, no matter how righteous, always drags you backward. and Ethan had worked too hard to escape the gravity of ego. He took a long breath. If he acted out of rage, he'd lose everything he'd rebuilt inside himself. If he did nothing, he'd betray the principles he'd taught. This was the real test, not to win, but to stay true. He met Lucas in the same boardroom where it all began. No audience this time, just two men and the truth between them. You think integrity slows you down, Ethan said quietly, but without it, speed leads nowhere. Lucas smirked. You still don't get it. The world rewards results, not morals. Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe, but results fade. Reputation doesn't. You're building on sand. He slid the documents across the table. Evidence, clear, undeniable. And then he said something Lucas didn't expect. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to give you a chance to stop before you destroy yourself. For a long moment, Lucas didn't move. His arrogance cracked just slightly. And in that silence, Ethan felt something rare. Compassion without weakness. He left the building without looking back. He'd done what was right, not what was easy. That night, alone again, he realized what peak performance truly meant. It wasn't the ability to dominate under pressure. It was the ability to stay human under fire. Weeks later, regulators stepped in. Lucas's plan collapsed under its own lies. But Ethan's name remained untouched. His reputation, once questioned, now stood as proof that integrity isn't naivety. It's endurance. Reporters wanted interviews. Publishers wanted books. He declined most of them. He didn't need to tell the world what he'd learned. He needed to live it. He spent his days mentoring quietly, working with young minds, not teaching them how to win, but how to stay whole while trying. He told them stories not about victory, but about alignment. He said, "You don't rise by climbing faster, you rise by climbing clearer." Some understood instantly. Others needed years. But all of them saw in Ethan something rare. Peace that didn't flinch. Months later, during a talk at a small university, a student asked him, "What's the hardest part of staying true to your values?" Ethan smiled softly. "Not letting pain make you cynical. The world will test you, not to break you, but to see if you believe what you say when it costs you something." The audience went quiet. He continued, "Anyone can be calm when things are easy. Real mastery is staying calm when everything you built catches fire and still choosing to walk through it without hate." He closed his talk with one final thought. Peak performance isn't about control. It's about alignment. When your actions, emotions, and purpose move as one, you become unshakable. That night after the event, Ethan walked alone through the city. The air smelled of rain and memory. He passed the old building where his company's name still glowed on glass, smaller now, under new ownership. He didn't feel bitterness, only gratitude. He whispered, "Some mountains aren't meant to be owned, just climbed once so you know you can." Then he smiled, because peace wasn't something he was protecting anymore. It was something he'd become. And in that quiet, Ethan finally understood. Peak performance isn't the victory at the end. It's the grace you hold in the middle of chaos, the discipline to act with integrity when no one's watching, the strength to walk away without resentment. He looked up at the skyline, rain glimmering on glass, and breathed deeply. Not as a man who'd conquered the world, but as one who'd mastered himself. The city was quiet that night, but the silence didn't feel like peace. It was heavy, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to falter. Ethan walked through the streets, the glow of neon reflecting on puddles from earlier rain. Every step echoed memories of battles fought, boardroom betrayals, sleepless nights, moments where the fire of ambition threatened to consume him entirely. He had won many victories, yet the scars of each victory pressed against him like invisible weights. He had become a master of performance, but mastery, he knew, comes with a cost. And tonight, the cost was calling his name. He entered his apartment empty except for the soft hum of the city outside. For years, he had measured success in metrics, profits, deals, accolades. Now he measured it in stillness, in the moments when he could breathe without the knife of expectation pressing against his ribs. And yet, even stillness demanded effort. A letter lay on the table, unsigned, containing threats veiled as warnings. Lucas had regrouped, his schemes far from finished. Even though Ethan had resisted revenge before, the pull was tangible, intoxicating. He felt the old fire rise, the same fire that once burned through his nights, devouring sleep and sanity alike. But he stopped. He inhaled deeply, letting the tension settle in his chest. He had faced temptation before. He knew the price of succumbing: chaos, regret, lost integrity. The power of discipline, he realized, was not in action alone. It was in restraint. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office, not to confront, not to battle, but to strategize quietly. He mapped the situation carefully, considering every risk, every reaction. He could crush Lucas, ruin his career in days. But would that preserve his peace or destroy it? He wrote a plan not for vengeance, but for defense. Every move measured, precise. Every communication neutral, factual. He was no longer a man fueled by ego. He was a man guided by principle. And in that discipline, he found a strange thrill, the thrill of power that doesn't consume, the exhilaration of control that doesn't demand cruelty. Weeks passed. The board caught wind of discrepancies in Lucas's plan independently. Regulators intervened. Lucas faltered, not because Ethan had struck, but because the system itself revealed the truth. Ethan remained untouched, silent, invisible, and yet fully victorious. It was the rarest kind of triumph, complete, uncelebrated, earned, because he had resisted the temptation to act out of rage, and in doing so discovered a deeper power than any victory could provide. Late one night, Ethan sat on the rooftop of his building again, the city stretching beneath him like a galaxy of lights and shadow. He reflected on the past years, the obsession, the burnout, the victories and betrayals, the nights when he had almost lost himself. And he realized something fundamental. Peak performance is never about external conquests. It is about mastering the inner landscape, navigating the storms within, and emerging intact. He watched the rain begin again, gentle, cleansing, and allowed himself to feel it without rush or resistance. Every droplet was a reminder. The world could test him endlessly, but he was no longer bound by its chaos. He was bound only by the principles he had chosen. Memories surfaced. The faces of colleagues, friends, the mentors he had learned from, the lessons carved into his bones. Each one was a marker of growth, a proof of survival. Ethan's gaze fell on his hands, rough from work and years of labor. They had built, protected, restrained, guided, and occasionally healed. These hands now trembled only with awareness, not fear. He allowed himself a smile. It was not smug or boastful. It was quiet, deliberate, and true. The phone buzzed, another potential crisis awaiting attention. For a fleeting moment, the old Ethan's reflex rose. Check it, act immediately, dominate, win, but he put the phone down. He could handle anything tomorrow. Today, he would simply breathe. Today, he would simply be, because he had learned the final truth of mastery. The highest performance is not the one that moves fastest, pushes hardest, or consumes all. It is the one that endures, the one that resists corruption, maintains integrity, and walks away from chaos unshaken, the one that embraces stillness as fiercely as it once embraced ambition. Morning came. The sun broke through clouds, spilling light across streets slick with rain. Ethan walked slowly, not to a destination, but into the moment. The city moved around him, frantic and unknowing, and yet he moved within it unshaken. He had faced betrayal, moral tests, and the seduction of shortcuts. He had seen the world attempt to drag him back into obsession and fire. And he had resisted. Now peace was no longer fragile. It was forged. Tempered in trials, tempered in restraint, tempered in the darkness of ambition itself. He paused at a bridge, looking at the water reflecting the sky. The reflection showed a man who had been tested, scarred, and remade. He no longer needed to conquer the world to feel alive. He only needed to honor the integrity he had cultivated within. Ethan whispered to himself, "I have walked through fire and not been consumed. I have faced the storm and not lost myself. Peace is not given. It is earned. And now I am free." For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pull of obsession. No phantom urgencies, no gnawing pressure, no restless fire. Only clarity, only calm, only a deep, abiding presence. He turned from the bridge, taking slow, deliberate steps. The city buzzed around him, indifferent and alive. And for the first time, Ethan walked not as a man trying to survive the world, but as a man who had survived himself. In the quiet mastery of his own soul, he had found the ultimate victory. Not loud, not celebrated, but complete. And with that, he vanished into the rhythm of the city, unshaken, unhurried, finally whole.